Thank you indeed, Brother Hatcher. I feel that it would be amiss within me if I didn't take just a brief minute of our time today to attempt to express my gratitude to the elders of the congregation here for this great lectureship. I am a history buff as much as my ability will allow me to be. I enjoy history. I like to read history. I enjoy getting books of history. And I firmly believe that this book and this particular lectureship will be considered by those in subsequent years as a hallmark, as a mountain peak event in the history of the church of this particular era. I think that those who are interested in what is happening in the church today will arise and call you blessed because of the material that is being given, the lessons being presented, and that will enable subsequent generations to see at least that there were those who were careful to call us into the realm of the old past. Many long years ago, as a student at Freed-Hardeman College, I remember so very well getting up quite early. In fact, maybe 7 or 7:30 in the morning, and we would go over and listen to Brother Gus Nichol. Year after year, it was the pattern for Brother Nichol to begin the lectureship each morning early. And then there would be Brother H. Leo Bowles, Brother Hardeman, Brother G.K. Wallace, and other good brethren. And it was a treat to get up early and listen to those great, good, and godly men over 50 years ago. And I feel fortunate indeed that I was able to sit at the feet of those great men and listen to them as they attempted to instill within us, as younger preachers, the principles that still inhere within so many of us even today. I wish there were more people here, but that is just wishful thinking. Any one of you brethren could present material on the eldership, and I'll tell you one thing, you could give a lot more material in the course of a study than any of us would want to give an account for in the day of judgment. And so as we enter into our second study yesterday, you remember we dealt with the positive or negative qualifications, and we talked about 8 of them: not given to wine, and no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, not a brawler, not covetous, not self-willed, not soon anger, and then the final one, you can look it up for yourself. And maybe if I were not a novice, I would know that last one, you see. And that's really what it was. But I hope that you will continue to study those positive qualifications. And let me reiterate one thought, that brethren today who are so averse to anything that is negative would certainly have a real problem dealing with Paul's qualifications of a negative nature, which he gave to Titus and to Timothy. Now this morning we want to look at some of the positive qualifications. But before we enter into that, open your Bible to Isaiah 40:11. One of the great mountain peak passages in all of the Old Testament. I like that verse. In fact, I like them all, but I need that one. The Messianic prophet here talks about one who would come, and he would take the little lambs up in his arms. And that depicts, of course, a shepherd, doesn't it? And that individual who would take up those little lambs in his arms would be gentle to them. You know, I'd like to be that kind of person. Wouldn't it be marvelous if all of the elders or the shepherds everywhere would be like the chief shepherd in that respect? Gentle, kind, and considerate. And the kind of person who could just take up the sheep and hold them in their arms. Back home, as some of the brethren here know, behind our house there are some woods back in the area. And I have never had time to get back in those woods and cut the briars and clean up that area. So I bought my wife some goats. And they do a lot better job than I can do. But I distinctly remember when the first little baby goat was born. Our daughter Gail was still living at home. She was 30 some odd years of age, but she was still with us. So Gail adopted that little baby goat. And she would go out and sit in the woods down by the lake. And this little goat would be in her arms. Now I'm trying to make a point. And she would sit there and caress that little baby goat as she held it in her arms, and the little thing would go to sleep. And hours and hours and hours, Nita Gale would sit with the little creature in her arms, and she'd rub and caress it. And it would follow her up to the gate when she got ready to come back into the house. And it would stand there and it would bleat or blate or cry, whatever you call it. And it would want to come on into the house with her. But that was a no-no. Not long ago, I went down by the lake with some book material, and I was sitting there writing. Now this goat today, and I want to make a point here, it's grown. It has horns sticking out there that long, I promise you. And that thing came up, and it still wanted to get up into my lap as I sat there in the chair. And I would not let it in my lap. I was trying to write. And then it got around behind the chair, and this is the truth with his hand up. It began to butt the back of the chair. And I finally said, Billy, I can't write what the brethren need with a goat butting me. So I had to get up. But that thing would follow me to Pensacola, Florida. It really would. If I opened the gate and came this direction, it would follow me anywhere. And I thought, in preparation for our study as shepherds and as leaders, we ought to be the kind of shepherds or leaders that the sheep would be willing to follow us to the jumping off place. Now listen, brethren, that would resolve and solve all of the problems today if we had faithful shepherds like that. Someone told a story many years ago of a man who came running down the road, and he was all out of bread, and he stopped at a store. And he ran in and he said, did you see a bunch of people coming down the road here about 30 minutes or an hour ago? And the proprietor of the store said, yes, they came, and it's been a good while. The man said, which way did they go? And the fellow said, they went that way. And this man said, oh, me, said, I got to catch up with them. I'm their leader. And I believe that was Brother Gus Nichol that related that story. But can you imagine a leader being miles and miles and miles behind the sheep and trying to be a leader? As we look today at the positive qualifications of these men called shepherds, the first one given by the apostle that I'd like to really zero in on is that of desire. If a man desires the office or the work of a bishop, he desireth a good work. It just seems to me that the environment within a congregation ought to be such that our children, our little boys growing up, could look at the shepherds and say, I would love to be that kind of person. Oh, I'd like to be a shepherd like that. But brethren, let me tell you something. This is the truth. And I hate to say it. But so many times today in congregations, our children are looking at the elders and they're looking at the preachers, and they'll say, so help me God, I don't want to be like that. Now I can give you some examples if you want them, and I really can. And while I'm on that particular point, that's just another reason that we have a dearth of faithful gospel preachers today, because of that which our youngsters are seeing in the lives of the older people. Older people. Brethren are treating preachers worse than the scum of the earth. What young man wants to be a preacher when he's experiencing such things as that? Now that's the sordid side of it. Of course, there is always the better side. But we commend those young men who desire to be elders. If a young person is growing up and he wants to be a song leader, we encourage him. That's a wonderful desire, to be a great song director, song leader. And we ought to encourage our young people to be this. If a person within a congregation desires to be a Bible teacher, we encourage them. Really develop your ability and your capabilities and utilize all the strength that you can. We need faithful teachers. I don't know about you here and other places, but there is a great need for people to desire to be teachers. And then, of course, there is the great need for gospel preachers, elders. We need to put into effect some kind of effort to encourage young men to want to be elders. It's a noble aspiration, brethren. It is indeed a worthy work. But as we look in 1 Timothy and 1 Timothy chapter 3 and in Titus chapter 1, the desire to be an elder is followed by apt to teach. At least in our lesson this morning. I'll not give all of these in order. But an elder ought to be apt to teach. I just sat down and I wrote out a few things that it seems to me that inheres within this word apt. All of us ought to be apt to teach after a while has passed. Well, in the time that you ought to be teachers, you ought to be what? You ought to be teachers. And brethren, telling is not teaching. Verbalizing is not teaching. I suspect the parrot could verbalize if you could instruct it enough. But you ought to be teachers. What does it mean to be apt to teach? Listen, it means to be able to teach. And not all the while are we able to teach. And I'll confess to that. I recognize as much as is within me. And in this respect, I'll agree with you. My inability to teach as I'd like to teach. Now, I mean every word of that. I tell my wife sometimes I get exasperated at myself. I get upset that I'm not able to teach the brethren better than I'm teaching them. And the reason I say that, good friends, is simply because I can just teach and teach and teach and teach and teach, and it seems as if it does no good whatsoever at times. Do any of you others have any problem with that? Now listen, that is disconcerting to me. I almost want to join the prophet and find me a juniper tree and sit down under it and just sit there. It is discouraging. Why can we not see better results from our teaching today? My Lord had that problem, and He was an able teacher. Elders need to be able to teach. We had a man just up the road from where we live in Mount Juliet. I suspect he was a good man in a lot of respects. He was an elder. And they had the gospel advocate quarterlies reverted back to the old system, you know. You read a verse, and then sitting next to him, you read a verse, and what does it say? You read your verse, what does it say? Well, what does it mean? And then ride on around and ride around and ride around. So this elder would sit there on the beach Sunday after Sunday, and when it would come his time to read, he'd start stammering, stuttering. His wife would be the side of him. Brethren, listen, this is the truth. And she'd say a few words, and her husband then would babble them. He's an elder. And she'd say a few more words, and his wife would, having repeated, the husband say it. And I'm sitting in the funeral home there one day, and this man's sister-in-law and brother-in-law came in the office. They were sitting talking. And they broached the subject. The man was sick. Terribly sick. In fact, he did die in just a while. But the brother-in-law said, that fella can't even read. His wife spoke up and said, now, Wilson, he can read his name. He's an elder of the church. And I mentioned that's an extreme situation. But I wonder, friends, how effective we are as shepherds of the flock when we get to that point. We ought to be able to teach. Not only is that the case, but to be apt to teach involves being willing to teach. Now, a lot of people are willing to teach, but they're not capable of teaching. They're just not capable of teaching. You can throw me in that if you want to. A man could be willing to teach and not able. He might be able to teach and not willing to teach. You sit around and not do a thing. Well, if you have some light on a candlestick and you think you can go to heaven and stick that thing under a bushel, you're reading the wrong book, which I read. And so we ought to desire to be good shepherds and have the right motive, and then we ought to be apt to teach. Apt to teach, of course, the truth. Another thing that is involved in this matter of being a shepherd or a teacher, elder, is good behavior. That's one of the positive qualifications. Good behavior. We have an influence to wield in maybe a very brief circle or maybe a wide sphere. We need to rest assured that that influence will certainly be seen, it'll be noticed, it'll be here after we are gone. And so Paul said to Timothy, you teach these shepherds that they behave themselves. We started a congregation out in the Villages area, over in the Mount Juliet area. They had set aside 2 plots for church buildings, and we went out and were able to start one of the congregations out there. And one of the key points that I've tried to make over and over and over and over is simply this: brethren, if we will behave ourselves, this work will succeed. It's amazing to me how many people today in the church just simply do not know how or do not care about behaving themselves. Elders, shepherds, bishops, overseers will be influencing the sheep. And how do you expect the sheep to behave if the shepherds don't behave? Someone gave an illustration. I don't know who it was now, but I remember reading this over in the land of Palestine. The guide had spent a lot of time talking about the Syrian shepherds and the Palestinian shepherds, and how gentle and how careful and how concerned they were. They came up to a place, and here was this old fellow out there running after a sheep or a goat, and had a stick, and he was beating on it. And the guide got off the bus and went over to this fellow, was talking with him, reprimanding him a little bit. Came back on the bus. He said, he's not a shepherd. He's trying to catch the sheep to kill it. Trying to catch the sheep to kill it. I was in Bethlehem one time. I walked up to this place, and this man was selling kiskebad. That's a good way to say it in Palestine. And there was a sheep standing there. He was trying to sell me some of the stuff that he was cooking. I didn't want it. And then he looked over to that sheep. And he looked at me, and he drew his hand across his throat. And I left him. I would not have wanted him for my shepherd. A shepherd, dear people, needs to be the kind of an individual who is gentle, who is very loving, who is very careful in this respect. Moving on, Paul tells us that a shepherd is to be blameless. Blameless. Now, you know as much about this as I know it. I'm not trying to tell you anything new. Just simply to remind us. There are no perfect shepherds. Even Simon Peter, an elder, was to be blamed. We're not making excuses. There is that perfect goal toward which we're all striving. You expect an elder or shepherd to be perfect? You're expecting the wrong thing. But when it comes to being blameless, When an accusation is brought against a shepherd, then that should not be proven against that man. He ought to be blameless with respect to that. And I need that myself. And you do. All of us need that. We need to be blameless individuals. And then there is the matter of good report. When I get back home, or when you go back into the area where I live, you might want to stop and ask the question, what do you think about Wayne Coates? Now you come to me and let me give you a list who to ask first. I can tell you one thing, I don't want you to go down to Nashville, Tennessee, and I say this with all sincerity, and start asking a bunch of brethren down there, what do you think of Wayne Coates? And I'm being honest with you. But I can't help that if I try to correct error and liberalism and foolishness that's being taught. That's what those old brethren, as I mentioned in the beginning, 50 years ago, spent their lives doing. And sound and faithful brethren had a good report of those individuals. And so an elder ought to have a good report. Well, a preacher ought to have it. A member of the church ought to have a good report. And then there is the matter of being holy. Do I need to define what that means? To be holy? I don't know. Somebody read a book one time. It had a lot of different scratches in it. They called it Hebrew. And they told me that that word holy meant healthy. Well, I knew it meant holy because this little book here said holy. That's what it means. We're to be holy. We're to be healthy. Healthy in a number of ways. A shepherd ought to be holy. He ought to be healthy. I don't believe that if you had a group of expensive sheep, that you'd send a shepherd out to care for those sheep. If that shepherd was sickly, if he was maimed, if he was diseased in a physical way, you wouldn't want that. We just listened to a good lesson about David. We'd want someone who would care for those sheep and protect them against the enemies instead of bringing the enemies in. That's one of the real problems we're having today in the church. And I oftentimes say elders used to try to keep the wolves out. Now they're inviting them in, and you know that's the truth. And you ought to be saying it too. Quit worrying about whether somebody's going to like you or not, or this matter of political expediency. Quit worrying about that foolishness. There's a lot of brethren not going to oppose anything because it's not politically expedient. They don't want me to oppose it. Well, I don't think we ought to be brash and uncouth in this, but how are you going to deal with the devil? How are you going to deal with it? So Paul tells us that we need to be holy. We need to be healthy. And then we're to be given to hospitality. Way out in the desert area, over in Palestine, you see a big sign stuck up there and it says, hospitality can be so easy. Drink Coca-Cola. And that impressed me. Hospitality can be so easy. Brethren, I'll tell you one thing. As I reflect back on the years which have passed, I honestly and earnestly believe that one of the reasons I may have decided to become a gospel preacher and try to wield a little bit of influence is because of the fact that my mother and my daddy opened up their home to gospel preachers when I was a baby, when I was a toddler, and when I was a tow-headed boy. Preachers would come to conduct gospel meetings, and we were extremely poor back in the Depression era, early 30s. And my mother would give the preacher the very best that we had in that home. And I grew up around preachers being there. And those preachers were esteemed highly. And they were admired, and they were loved, and they were cared for. And we didn't have roasted preacher. Every night after the service and every morning after the morning service in those protracted meetings. But there was just something about those men that was an attraction to me. And I thank God for it. I wish I could be that kind of person. Way out in Texas a number of years ago, there was a little boy in an orphan's home. He had a rich, wealthy brother that would come over to the orphan's home and bring him gifts and just pile them up. And this brother would drive away in a beautiful, shiny automobile. One day when that brother came to bring something for his little brother, there was another little boy standing there. And he looked at all of this and he said, "You know, I wish," and he hesitated. And someone thought he was going to say, "I wish I had a brother like that." He didn't. He said, "I wish I could be a brother like that." And that's what I wish I could be like. I wish I could be the kind of an individual that could be more hospitable. The preacher drove up to a house and said, "Am I supposed to stay here?" "Well, no, go on up yonder and stop at that house, and if they won't keep you, I will. They won't keep you, I will." How would you like to hear that? You're almost willing to go down and sleep under the bridge, aren't you? We ought to be hospitable. I think of that Shunammite woman who had her husband to build a room on the house. When I built my house, I drew up the plans myself and tried to build most all of it, and it's still standing. And I told my wife, I said, "This room here is for the man of God. Don't want any church trash in this room. Man of God." And we've had 1, 2, 3, 4. I know we've had 4 of these brethren here in that room. If you brethren get trashy, don't you come up there. Think you're going to stay in that room. But we're hospitable. And brethren need to be hospitable. That's what the Lord was. I was going in a gospel meeting. We had a bunch of people came in to the service traveling. I don't know how many there were. My wife took them all out to dinner, and I came home and she said, "It cost me $90. I said, "Oh, there's the whole corn crop." Spent it every bit of the corn crop trying to feed that bunch of people there. And when you come up, don't bring that many, please. But we're trying to be hospitable. And the doors of brethren and sisters today, they are shut. Amen? They're shut. We're too busy to be hospitable. We don't have time to show hospitality. Romans chapter 12. And if we do sometimes, it is grudgingly. Show hospitality without grudging. I'm glad I grew up in a family. Didn't have much. We were willing to be hospitable. Brethren, let me tell you something. Hospitality can be so easy. Just give me a Coca-Cola. And give it not grudgingly. But we're to hold fast the faithful word. And let me stop here, Brother Michael, in just a minute. Holding fast. Young preachers, let me give you a sermon. To hold fast. Matthew 24:25, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Now you can hold to that, I promise you. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. You can hold fast to that. And then in 2 Timothy 2:13, hold fast the form of sound words. Now that's a mandate. That's not a suggestion. Hebrews 3:6. Hold fast the confidence and the hope firm unto the end. The Bible doesn't tell you anywhere how to quit, does it? Elders, hold fast the form of sound words. And then we have a high priest over the house of God. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for He is faithful that is promised. And then the 3 congregations over in Asia, our Lord wrote and He said, hold fast, and hold fast. Here, young preacher, you want this? That'll preach. Now, Brother Keeble used to say, in conclusion, or concluding with a conclusion, a shepherd ought to be the husband of one wife and rule his children well. I sent out a number of questionnaires to a lot of brethren, but I got stopped and put it on the back burner on whether an elder had to be married or whether you had to have one child or many children. I think one of the most judicious things I read on that from Brother Gus Nichols. And if I had time, I might explore that in the morning. There are over 600 articles in the Old Gospel Advocate on elders. And I've spent months reading them. What priceless material. I know when to quit.